What's up, everyone? True Techno Gamer here, back in full effect. Please like, subscribe, and comment. Give me some comments, show me some love. Let me know that you're paying attention. Let me know what you think. I guarantee you, the more I hear back from you guys, the more frequent the videos will come to. Keep me motivated so I can keep entertaining and educating you guys on these various topics. So now, for this video, I really want to just take a minute, step back, and commend Sony and Microsoft for the performance that we are seeing from the Xbox Series X in particular and the PS5, the next gen consoles, if you will. There's been a lot of talk of people just kind of dismissing them as is typical. Well, the consoles are, they're like low to mid spec PCs. They can't do this, they can't do that. And the reality is, we haven't seen what they can do because developers aren't taking advantage of it. We're still very much in this cross-gen phase where we're basically playing upgraded versions of PS4 and Xbox One games still. We haven't really seen a brand new, built from the ground up, from start to finish, next-gen game yet. And there's various reasons for that. That's probably a whole nother video. But for what we are seeing, even with those cross-gen games, the level of performance we are getting, I will venture to say, is arguably the most balanced and the best performing new consoles we probably have ever seen. And it's pretty amazing. So I'm going to throw out some numbers, some facts to let you guys know where I'm coming from with this. And then we're going to go a little bit deeper. And I'm going to show you guys some real world examples of some games and looking at some analysis of frame rates, of performance, resolution, etc. that shows these consoles are pretty legit. So stay tuned after the intro. All right, so let's get into this, man. These consoles have been freaking amazing thus far. And I really want to just take time to really show and prove that point and show why they've been amazing, why they've been better than previous console generations we've seen, just from a performance standpoint. At the high level, what are we getting with these new consoles? We're getting 8-core Zen 2 CPUs, 16 threads, so essentially 16, software cores, logical cores. But 8 cores, 16 thread CPUs running at 3.5 gigahertz and above between the two, PS5 and Series X. We're getting GPUs with 10 to 12 teraflops of horsepower from RDNA 2, which is AMD's latest and greatest architecture with ray tracing support. We're getting 16 gigabytes of RAM, of GDDR6 RAM, and we're getting ultra-fast SSDs at standard, with the minimum being 2.4 gigabytes per second, which is, roughly 50 times faster than what we saw in the last generation. But let's talk about some numbers, right? I'm talking about the ability to hit the performance of what those specs indicate consistently. And that's where I say that is arguably the best. So let me throw out some numbers at you guys. For one, literally 99% of games that have come out for the PS5 and Xbox Series X, not counting all the backward compatible games, not counting PS4 and Xbox One games, but games that are coming out for PS5 and Xbox Series X, 99% of them, nearly all of them, have 60 FPS support, have at least a 60 FPS mode. There may be a handful of outliers, guys. Let me know what other outliers are out there. But from what I gather, I know the Medium is one of those games that only runs at 30, I believe. Watch Dogs Legion was one of those outliers that only ran at 30, but Ubisoft has since patched that to run at 60 now. So now it's up to speed. But generally speaking, almost every game, right? And then as a bonus, you have 60 Hz modes added to legacy backwards compatible games. Games like The Last of Us Part 2, put that in the PS5. That game is not really changed, but it's running at a full 60 FPS, which is awesome. Or God of War, Days Gone, a lot of the Sony first-party games. Microsoft has this great program called FPS Boost that is a technology that allows the Series X and S to increase the frame rate on a bunch of older Xbox games. So they actually have more games that support 60 or even 120 FPS. So that's to my next point. Almost full 60 FPS coverage across the board. On top of that, we have a number of 120 FPS games out on those systems. PS5 has well over 20 or just over 20. And then the Series X, I believe, has over 70, almost 80 games that support 120 hertz. Again, a lot of those are for the FPS boost program for a lot of the older Xbox One games or even older. But still, yeah, it's a great use of the power of that box to enhance your old game. So we're seeing absolutely stellar performance. There's been a lot of talk coming from the last year, coming from PS4 and Xbox One, which admittedly were very much limited by those lowly, pretty piss poor Jaguar CPUs. But what that really meant is that while there were some great looking games on PS4 and Xbox One, most of the games, the default was 30 FPS because the CPU just wasn't fast enough, relatively fast enough to keep those GPUs fed. And we saw that. Even games that targeted 60 almost rarely hit it, and was generally dropping quite a bit and averaging somewhere in the 30s or 40s, maybe 50s. And I'll show you some examples of that. But we're seeing 60 FPS across the board. And not only that, but again, the consistency. I'm saying that the vast majority of games on PS5 and Xbox Series X not only run at 60, but they run at 60 99% of the time. Most of the games have a 99th percentile FPS of 60, or at least 59 point something, right? 59 plus. We're talking like a pretty stable 60, which effectively means that these games are running with a minimum frame rate of 60. Now that's meaningful, right? So when you think about comparing that to the PC, which most PC benchmarks use an average FPS, which is not entirely Apple, and it's definitely not apples to apples comparison to the consoles that are running at mostly a minimum of 60 FPS. And I'll get into that. But that's really amazing. That's a huge jump up from, again, almost every generation of console before. We've seen some 60 FPS games, but if you go back and look at the analysis, many of them never ran anywhere near a constant 60. We're seeing that in a lot of games, even the biggest games, the most intense games that exist now. I have generally surmised that the PS5 is, on average, as a baseline, the GPU in that box should be equivalent to a GTX 2080, on average. And the Series X, being a little bit more powerful, is probably closer to a 2080 Super, somewhere around it, right? A lot of people have just gone out and dismissed the console GPUs and just set things as low as a 2060 Super, to just, it's basically a 2070 or even a 2070 Super, or a 5700 XT. And I've said many times that it's not the case. It's definitely above all of those GPUs in terms of its potential. Now, of course, that all depends on the implementation. That depends on the software. That depends on the developer, what they're doing. Some engines are going to work better than others. Some engines, we can see the PS5 GPU really approach a 2080 Ti/3070, no problem. And in other engines, in other cases, that may be less optimized for the hardware, less optimized for AMD as particular, we can see the PS5 and Series X perform like a 2070 or even a 2060 Super or something like that. So, of course, it can range, but looking at the specs and looking at the potential, the baseline generally should be a 2080 is what I've been surmising. 2080 to 2080 Super for PS5, 2080 Super to approaching a 2080 Ti for a Series X. That's what I have been saying. What I'm seeing for the last year or so is that much of the data, much of the actual games that we have seen kind of support that when you really dig into the numbers and actually try to make a accurate and a comparison to PC, right, to PC equivalent cards. If you go by my estimation and say the baseline is 2080, then up until August 2020, they would have been, respectively, the number 2 and 3 GPUs commercially available, right? 2080 and 2080 Super were 2 and 3. 2080 Ti was top of the king of the hill, right? So you're talking number 2, number 3. That's way beyond where the PS4 was, for example, at the time of its launch, right? That's not bad for a console, cheaper box, smaller box, etc. Now, by the time we get to November, Ampere is out, so we got the 3080, right? Cards out, 3090, 3070. And then AMD releases 6800, 6800 XT cards. Now we have a 6700 XT. So the landscape has changed. There are cards that are above what a 2080 was, what a 2080 Super was now. But think about it like this. You can do a quick search on Steam hardware servers that shows the different GPUs that most of the Steam community has. Now, obviously not all the PC gamers are only on Steam. We get all that. But it's usually one of the best, approximations we can get. Just get a sense of the landscape. You can do a quick search on there, right? I've done this already, by the way. At the time of launch, right, as of the end of 2020, even with Ampere and RDNA 2 cards, big Navi cards out in the market, and then even just looking at the GPU in isolation, represented the 95 percentile in terms of PCs out there that people are gaming on, with Steam at least, right? What that means is that, what I'm saying is that the PS5 and Series X is faster, more performant in terms of their GPUs, video cards, than 95% of the actual PCs out there.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
Now, I want to go into some specific examples, right? And let's go back for a minute. Let's go back and look at some examples in the previous generations of what a game that targeted 60 FPS looked like, because it's probably not what you remember, right? Now, there, of course, is a lot of examples I can show to prove my point, and there's obviously going to be some examples that conflict with my point, because there's always going to be some outliers, of course. I can do this all day, but I'm just showing you guys some examples that I come across, that's easy for me to show that really illustrates what I am saying, okay? So let's dig into that. Alrighty, so first, let's take it back to the PS3, Xbox 360 era. We're looking at oldie but a goodie, a favorite, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. Now, back in the day, Call of Duty was one of the first, first-person shooter games to try to target 60 across the board, across all platforms. And look at what's happening here. So this was a 60 FPS game back in the PS3, Xbox 360 era. And we see dips down to the 30s when the action is kicking in. If you look at both sides, it almost never hits a steady 60. Even when there's very little things going on right now, like there's no action on the screen, it's still not 60. That explosion dropped it down on the PS3, as you see, to the 20s, and the Xbox 360 is still hovering around the 30s. So, needless to say, this is nowhere near 60 FPS. You guys might remember this one. This was one of my favorite launch games of the PS4, actually. I thought the graphics were amazing. This is Killzone Shadowfall. And you can see here, this is a title that shipped at the time, running on the PS4 at 1080p, and it ran at an unlocked frame rate, right? But the unlocked frame rate was capped at 60. So the game was free to try to hit 60. And in very, very few cases it did. But generally speaking, when you were playing the game, this is what you saw. You were running generally in the 30s, somewhere between 30 and 40. Again, it almost never hit 60, at least not in the single player. The multiplayer did a little bit better because they dropped the resolution, so it could hit 60 a lot more frequently. But even then, it didn't hit a consistent 60. So this was the idea of running a game above 30 with an uncapped frame rate back in the PS4 at launch. So here's another one around the PS4 launch. This is Battlefield 4. Great game. I really enjoyed it at launch, but let's look back. Now this is a game that, was fairly well optimized at the time. So we thought. If you see, it actually does hit 60 quite a bit. It spends a good amount of time at 60, but look at it. It's nowhere near consistent. It's definitely nowhere near a constant. It drops quite a bit. As action goes on, you see it's dipping down to the low 40s here, 44. Definitely not a smooth, consistent experience, kind of what we expect nowadays. But this was our experience at launch, right? Back on the PS4 as well. So let's look at another PS4 era game. Now this is a game that came out much later in the PS4 era. This game is only a few years old. It's a great game. That's, to me, one of the best looking games on the PS4 overall. This is Resident Evil 2 Remake. This is the Digital Foundry analysis. And they're showing the original consoles and the enhanced consoles side by side, as you see here. Pay particular attention to the PS4 and Xbox One. Again, this was a great looking game, but part of the reason why we needed these enhanced consoles, the PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X, was to get a little bit more performance, because these original consoles were not capable of maintaining a consistent level of performance. As you see here, Xbox One is dipping into the 30s. This is a 60 FPS game, right? It's basically hovering around 30. The PS4 is a little bit higher, but it's generally around 40 or in the 40s, right? The Pro and Xbox One do a much better job of hitting 60, but again, just looking at what our experience was, a lot more people had PS4 and Xbox One than had the enhanced versions. So this was pretty normal, right? This is what we were used to. Many people played the game, of course, on a PS4 like this and probably thought it was fine, but in reality, it was far, far from a consistent experience on the PS4 and the Xbox One. So now let's jump ahead and look at what games are looking like now on the next generation consoles, PS5 and Xbox Series X and S. So we're looking at Resident Evil 8 or Resident Evil Village. This is running without RT. I mentioned I'm deliberately omitting RT because with ray tracing enabled, the performance overhead is, pretty heavy. And a lot of games may start to suffer a bit more with ray tracing. Most games still do not use ray tracing, but I can see that, a lot of my argument breaks down when it comes to ray tracing. So I'm focusing on the non-RT, which is probably how a lot of people will run it. But without RT, the game is running at a locked 4K, native 4K, and as you see, a completely locked 60. I want you to remember all of the examples I gave of games running on PS3 or PS4, Xbox One, right? That graph on the bottom almost always was jaggy. That line was moving up and down, up and down. It was never flat. Look at this. I'm talking now, I'm about to show about a 1 minute clip. There's action going on. We're in the middle of a cinematic. The frame rate is not dipping whatsoever. Not at all. And the fact of the matter is, in this game, with RT off, this game is pretty much a 99.9% 60 FPS game for the entire experience. We have never seen that before in last gen. Even with RT though, guys, okay, VG Tech's analysis showed that even with RT, it still maintained a 60 FPS, over 80% of the time, right? So the vast majority of it still hits 60 even with RT. But just for the sake of my my demonstration here, I wanted to show what is possible. This is not something that we would have ever seen, in games last gen for the most part. It is absolutely flat. So kudos to Capcom, and then again, kudos to Microsoft and Sony. All right, next up we have Far Cry 6 on PS5. This is a pretty recent release. This game only came out a few weeks ago, and the latest in the Far Cry saga. The game targets 4K and targets 60 FPS, and look at this. We're in the middle of some heavy action. There's explosions going off. There's screen effects. What you're seeing there is a little bit of a frame time dip, but look at the FPS in the upper left-hand corner, guys. As you see, even with all this action and everything going on, explosions galore, it is locked. It is a pretty much flat blue line. It never dips below 60. All right, and I'm going to let it play for a little bit longer. More action, more explosions. This isn't like just sitting there looking at the sky or something like that. Fire, we got fire going on. They're driving now. Again, we see a little stutter. That's what that is in the frame time graph. There's a little bit of drops here when you're driving, as you see, 58, 59 as you're moving. This is actually more probably of an issue, a bug in the game engine, because this happens on the PC as well. But again, generally speaking, the frame rate is pretty darn consistent. It's pretty much at 60 throughout. Even when the stutters are happening, the frame rate itself stays at a lock 60. All right, next up, this is a really interesting one. This is Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition that came out on the console. So we see PS5 along with the Xbox Series S and X. And in all cases, again, what are we looking at? A pretty much locked 60 FPS. Now, this game is interesting for a couple of reasons. The biggest one of which, this game uses ray tracing for all of the lighting. This is a fully ray traced game. So it's actually a pretty heavy load. And we're seeing it run with ray tracing almost at, again, it's super well optimized. by Metro, by the 4A game studio. And yeah, you see there's some dips here. Look, there's a lot of characters on screen now. This is actually one of the heaviest scenes. This is the stress test scene. But you see PS5 is still pretty much sitting pretty at a lock 60. Series S is dropping a frame or two here or there. But by and large, it's a lock 60. As we get into this other scene, that's a lot less intense, a lot less stressful on the systems. Again, locked 60, even on the Series S. And again, we saw the examples of last gen. Again, I can show many, many more, but it just was not common. I'm not saying there was no games that ran at a pretty locked 60. Obviously, there was some much less intensive games, some smaller indie games running, Xbox One, PS4. But by and large, it was not common. It was not the norm, especially with bigger AAA titles. But what we're seeing here, again, a fully ray-traced next-generation title in Metro Exodus. This is not a game, in this version at least, with the enhanced edition, running at 4K, dynamic 4K, targeting 60 with fully ray-traced lighting, and it's still a lock 60. Yeah, running this enhanced edition mode with the ray tracing features on your PC, good luck finding one that will run at, again, a minimum or a 99th percentile of 60, right? Good luck. You're going to need a really, really beefy system to even approach this level of consistency in performance. So again, kudos to 4A Games for sure for delivering a well-optimized next-gen experience with ray tracing. And kudos to Sony and Microsoft again for some great performing boxes. All right, one more for you. This is Doom Eternal running on the Series X PS5 in balance mode, meaning that it's a native 4K, even though it's dynamic, but it pretty much runs a native 4K and targets 60, and you see it's completely locked. It's not very interesting because Doom Eternal is a super, super well optimized game. We know that. But, so this is also interesting because this is one of the few games that have a 120 hertz mode on both systems, Series X and PS5, and we're essentially doubling the processing load on the consoles, right, on the actual systems. So we went from 60 to 100, and as you can see here, it's still running at a constant FPS, even at 120 frames. Now, a lot of this is due to the credit of id and just how well optimized Doom Eternal is. It is definitely not the case that every 120 hertz game runs at a constant frame rate, but I'm using this as an example because I just want to show that this is possible, right? If you take the time to optimize your engine very well and optimize your games for the platforms they're running on, you can achieve. Now these games, these are running at 1440p when in the 120 hertz mode, so it's still above full HD. It's dynamic 4K, but it's generally running at 1440p. Okay, and that's a great resolution. So it's still really high res, and it's running at 120 hertz, and it's again pretty consistent. Some dips here and there, but very, very rare. We're talking 99 percentile at a 120 FPS, which is just amazing on both systems. So let's take one more look at a game. Here's a PS5 game. This is a PS5 console exclusive and PC. So this is not a cross-gen game. And this is Deathloop, which is also a pretty awesome game. Recently came out last month. And you see, this is the performance mode. So the game comes with a visual quality mode that basically just runs at a higher resolution, higher average resolution. It's a dynamic resolution throughout. And then performance mode, with the goal here is to, again, hit 60. We've seen that and heard that before. The goal, the target is 60. But we, again, historically don't see it happen too often. And here's another example of absolutely rock solid, almost 100% consistency with that 60 FPS performance. The only sacrifice here is, there's no ray tracing, and the resolution, the average resolution is a little bit lower than what you see in the visual quality mode. Other than that, the game pretty much looks identical to the other mode, the visual quality mode, but again, rock solid performance. I mean, it's almost boring, right? And I'm tired of all the arguing and the console warring. These consoles deliver, right? If you talk about 60, it's one thing to say 60, it's another thing to actually deliver 60 consistently. And most PCs can't do that, which is why you want to have a really, really beefy PC to give you the overhead to give you an average FPS that's going to be like 80 or 90 in a game, so that you can hit a minimum of 60, which is what we're seeing here, right? Remember, this is 60 FPS cap. So the system is clearly running this game at above 60 FPS. We just can't see it because the FPS is capped, right? But if it dropped below 60, we would definitely see that. As we, I've shown that in several videos here. You've seen some dips below 60. So again, this is just immaculate performance, and it's just one less thing to worry about. And again, I would argue that just the general ability to hop into your game and get this level of consistency with your performance is something that is really, really hard to do even on PC. Even if you have a PC whose specs are higher on paper, you'll find that in most cases, you're not going to get the level of consistency with the performance as you're seeing here with these consoles.
Message!
Okay, guys, I was just talking about consistency in performance. And this is my favorite part of this video. So make sure you pay attention and try to follow me here, okay? So we're looking at Far Cry 6 again. And this is on a PC and Xbox Series X. As you saw, the PC version is running on a 3060 Ti, running at a fixed resolution of 1800p, trying to match this Xbox Series X. So the Xbox Series X runs Far Cry 6 with a dynamic 4K resolution, where most of the time is spent around 1800p. That's why they did that, okay? And they also ran the PC version at high settings because the console doesn't run at ultra max everything. It runs at generally about high settings, okay? Now, when you look at these two side by side, the problem with the industry today is, when you look at these two side by side, most people will look at this and say, oh, it's an obvious win for the PC here, right? It's an obvious win for the RTX 3060. We see that it's generally running above 60. It did dip a little bit to about 59, 58 a couple times in some high action. But remarkably, the Xbox is running at a lock 60. It's pretty consistent, right? But the 3060, yeah, it's generally, like right now, this is still images. They're both sitting there. It was 65. Here's the 3060 again, kind of at a walkthrough. And we see that it's running in mid 60s, approaching 70, right? In some cases, it might even hit above 70, right? There you go. So like for like scenes here, 60 to 71. Now, guys, listen. When you look at the screen, is it accurate and fair to say that the 3060 Ti runs this game faster than the Series X? The answer is no. It's not fair to say that, because given this, what we're looking at here, we don't have enough information. And here is why. You got to remember that the Xbox Series X, as you have seen and has been my point of this video, these consoles are running these games at a virtually locked, frame rate. When you run a game at locked 60 FPS where there is a FPS cap, so the Xbox Series version is capped at 60. That means that even if internally that GPU was able to churn through this game and run it at 100 FPS, we would never see that. The game is capped at 60, right? So it's not indicative at all of what the actual hardware is capable of doing when you run with a capped frame rate. So we see that the Xbox is running capped at 60, but we don't really know what its true frame rate is if it was running uncapped. The PC in this example is obviously running uncapped, so we see that it's generally about 70, mid 60 to 70, right? But look at this scene. The Xbox Series X could absolutely be running the same scene at 70. We really don't know, right? The other thing is that the Xbox Series X version of this game is V-synced. And V-sync means that, first of all, there's a performance overhead associated with V-sync, okay? So you're going to lose some FPS just when running V-sync. The second thing is that V-sync is a way to keep the game aligned with the actual refresh rate of the monitor, right? So in some cases, they'll actually delay some frames in order to make sure that the two stay in sync. So again, V-sync adds additional overhead, and it's not a fair representation at all of what the actual hardware is doing. It makes the game feel much smoother, which is what it's doing here, but it's not necessarily, again, reflecting the absolute performance of the system. So when you take those two things into consideration, even though that these settings, and this is I'm not at all, downplaying or ranking on this guy here. This is Wolfgang is the name of the site. he does these analysis quite a bit. He uses the 3060 Ti because it's, I think a close proxy to the consoles. But here's the thing, right, that I've been saying as part of this video. Most people have just downplayed the console performance and said, oh, it's just a 2070 or maybe a 2070 Super. Most people would absolutely scoff at the idea that the Xbox Series X or PS5 can come close to matching a 3060 Ti. Now, for reference, a 3060 Ti is closest to a 2080 Super card from last generation by NVIDIA. It is no coincidence, by the way, that we're seeing these Xbox Series X, even in these scenes, come pretty darn close to matching it, even if you did not account for the fact that it's frame capped. But when you look at that, in this action scenes, the 3060 dropped, right? The 3060 is normally around 70. When this action kicks up, it drops down to much, much closer to 60, where you see the Series X is matching it. But again, the Series X could be running the scene at higher, which is to say, the takeaway from this particular video, if you look at it properly, is that the Series X is matching, if not exceeding in several scenes, the performance on the 3060 here, Ti, sorry. And the 3060 Ti, again, is 2080 Super level, or even higher in some cases, thought to be much, much higher than the consoles. Now, Far Cry 6 is an AMD-aligned title. It's much more optimized for AMD in general, so it should run better on AMD hardware, including the consoles. That's a fact. But that's the whole point, right? Software is really, where it's at. It's all about the software and how the developer optimizes the game. If you optimize the game well on the consoles, you absolutely can see a Series X match a 2080 Ti, for example, or 3070. With a well-optimized game, that is not beyond reason. The PS5 as well could approach that. 2080 Super to 2080 Ti level, absolutely. If it's a game that doesn't run well on AMD and it's not optimized well for the consoles either, then you can see performance down to 2070 level, 2060 Super level, So that's just how this works. And okay, guys, so what I'm looking at here is Far Cry 6 GPU performance analysis from TechSpot. The reason why I'm showing this from TechSpot, there's a lot of great websites out there. TechSpot is one of my favorites as well. But the reason why I'm showing TechSpot is because they are savvy enough, right? And they are, they peep game. And they realize that when you just show an average frame rate, you're not giving the full picture. You're not giving an accurate picture of what the experience will be like of playing that game on that platform, on that PC, spec. Average frame rate could mean, if you see an average of 60, that means that it can drop down to 30s or 40, right? That means that it can be running some scenes at 100, right? It's just an average. It doesn't give you that sense of consistency. So what they have done is, instead of using 99 percentile, which is another great metric, 99 percentile means that the game runs at or above that frame rate for 99% of the time, which is basically what I've been showing you guys, that 60 FPS or 59 point something is roughly 99 percentile for the vast majority of PS5 and Series X games. On the PC side, most websites and GPU benchmarking, media don't really reflect that. They just give you averages. So TechSpot is showing what they call the 1% low frame rate. 1% low frame rate is kind of the opposite of what the 99 percentile is. It's showing an average, basically an average of the lowest 1% of frame rate. So if you took the minimum frame rate could be just one random outlier that, for some reason the game hit 20 FPS, right? And we don't know why. And it could only hit 20 one time, and the rest of it was like above 50. So minimum is not good either. So the 1% kind of eliminates those single outliers and gives you, the bottom 1% of the frame rate on average was about here. So it gives you a better sense of what the minimum frame rate is, right? Like in a more consistent way. So needless to say, if you look at Far Cry 6, now I'm looking at it on medium quality. By the way, the consoles generally run a game at above medium quality, but it's a little bit closer because I'm showing it at 4K and the consoles run it at dynamic 4K where it drops below 4K. So it kind of balances out. So we'll just say, looking at this at 4K medium, the consoles are running at a little bit under 4K, but slightly higher settings in some cases, whatever. It kind of balances out for the most part. So looking at this here, and I want you to see the difference in that dark blue and that light blue bars. The dark blue is the average. So in some cases, you see there's a pretty big difference, right? If we look at the 3070 Ti line, okay, the average is 82, but the 1% low is 68. So that means that, it's dropping down into the upper 60s, fairly often, right? That's what that reflects. I mean, that's what you're going to see. So the real way to do a comparison here is to look at this graph. If you want to see what the Series X is doing when it's running at a pretty locked 60, you have to look at this and look at which GPUs here have a 1% load that's at or above 60. And as you see here, you're looking at immediately, it starts with the 3060 Ti, right? And even then, that 1% low is 61. You see it's an average of 70. So that's probably pretty close, right? But even the 2080 Ti is running at a 1% low of 67. We don't know. The Series X could have been running, even in those stress cases, at 65, 67, 68, close to 70, right? It's capped at 60, so we don't really know. So it's not a stretch to say that, again, the Series X is running this game somewhere between a 3060 Ti and a 2080 Ti. Not a stretch. It's in that range. Absolutely in that range. And of course, the 2080 Ti is pretty much a match for the 3070, if you want to put it in that terms. So it's not a stretch to say, again, Far Cry 6 is running at, close to 2080 Ti/3070 range. It's absolutely not a stretch. It might be a little bit below that. Like I said, it might be close to 3060 Ti, maybe a little bit above that. So it's probably in between. But again, we're probably talking within 10% of a 3070. The key takeaway here is, again, these consoles, I'm really proud. I'm pleasantly surprised in a way, but I'm just really proud. I think it warrants, us to actually acknowledge, because we spent so much time, years complaining about, the performance, complaining about lack of 60 FPS in games, complaining about inconsistent frame rates in games, complaining about, all these type of things, the image quality, jaggies and blurriness and shimmering. And these games are looking absolutely flawless, especially on 4K screens, super clean, super crisp, high res, with almost nearly immaculate performance. This deserves a commendation. Microsoft, Sony, thank you and congrats. You did it. I would still argue that a 2080 today is still high end. It's at least mid-high end. So even that being the baseline. But again, as I showed, there's plenty of cases where we can see 3060 Ti level, even approaching 3070 level, and 2080 Ti level. So that's nothing to sneeze at, and don't come at me with some low end or mid range. 2080 Ti is still not mid range. I'm sorry. All right, and it's still better than 95% of the PCs that you guys actually have and are actually playing with. All right, you gotta admit, man, PS5 and Xbox Series X, it's a pretty darn good bargain for the price, and you're getting pretty good performance. So that's it. Thank you for watching. Like I said, comment, like, subscribe to the page. More to come, guaranteed. Till next time.